I have to confess to a feeling of, it's a very bizarre feeling. You know, those of us who have spent our lives looking at data on India, many of them in this room, we are all in a bit of a quandary because we are finally in a situation where you can't actually trust any of the numbers that you're dealing with. And that's very, very difficult. I think Arun has explained very clearly what's wrong with the GDP data. The fact that it assumes the same relationship between formal and informal sectors when we know that that is no longer the case. But we don't actually have any reasonable way to judge our fiscal data anymore. We had the extraordinary situation. In fact, I have to second Dr. Yashwant Sinha in expressing complete surprise that nobody in the opposition demanded a breach of privilege against the finance minister for telling lies to Parliament. Because it is the first time, I believe, that we have had fiscal numbers that are completely wrong. And they're wrong on the expenditure side and they're wrong on the tax side. On the tax side, we have some notion of how much they're wrong because we know that, let's say, the indirect tax fell by that much, the direct tax fell by that much, so we have some idea of the numbers. On the expenditure side, we know that expenditures fell, according to the CAG report, by about 1.45% of GDP. But which sectors were cut? Which departments were cut? Which ministries were cut? We know, okay, they spent more on a statue. Did they spend less on something else? Which did they spend less on? We still don't know. The Indian population doesn't know. Parliament doesn't know. It's unbelievable that we are sitting there and knocking our heads about fiscal deficit numbers and whether they will be appreciated by global finance when they're all completely false. Let's take, for example, the fiscal deficit itself. Again, a point that Dr. Sinha mentioned. Officially 3.5% of GDP. CAG says it's 5.8% if you include all the unpaid dues that they have not given to the Food Corporation of India, to the estates deserving NREGA, etc., 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 all the different public sector enterprises. So we know that it's significantly higher. But if the denominator is significantly lower, which many of us suspect it is, then the fiscal deficit is presumably much, much higher. Not 5.8, maybe 7%. I mean, it's, again, we're in the realm of speculation only because none of us knows. If none of us knows what happens to the traditional macroeconomic assumptions which still guide all discussions about the budget. If you have a fiscal deficit of more than 3.5% of GDP, all hell will break loose. Inflation, capital flight, disaster, etc., etc. Here you have a fiscal deficit which is actually presumably double of that. The expected hell has not broken loose, which is all of those disasters, inflation, capital flight, etc., but nor have the benefits occurred, which would be, in fact, a rise in consumption. Right? In other words, something's going wrong. What does that tell us? It tells us that the other sectors of the economy are doing even worse. In other words, here is a government that is spending much more relative to the GDP. That means the private sector and households are actually spending much less in investment and consumption. And even the government spending that much more is not enough to counteract the terrible impact of these households and industry and private sector spending much less. That's a serious issue. In other words, the economic problem is not just, all this cyclical versus structural and, slowdown versus what was that episode. Forget all that. We are talking about a really extraordinary situation of crisis. Give it whichever other noun you want, but it's a very serious crisis. We know about the unemployment crisis, now we know about this consumption crisis, even though they're trying to suppress the data. But what it means in terms of an economy that is actually grinding to a halt in an extraordinary way is something that requires much, much greater attention. And so I think the urgency of this problem needs to be absolutely addressed immediately. In that context, I'd just like to mention a couple of other issues because there are many other excellent speakers and I'm sure there are questions as well. One is this issue of consumption. When I mentioned that we know that it's much worse, we have somehow, because of some leaks of the suppressed consumption data, we have some information about what has happened to consumption. And what is terrifying is that it is now apparent that consumption declines hit every decile of the population, top to bottom. The biggest declines are in the top decile, followed by the bottom decile. That is, the poorest people of India spent 11% less in real terms than they spent 7 years ago. That's the kind of decline we're seeing across the board, across every decile. It also suggests that poverty is significantly higher, at least 70 to 80 million people more in absolute poverty, unless, of course, they can change the definition and then suddenly bring everybody up, as they are suggesting they will do, revise the definition of poverty so that lots more people can be seen to be above it. But really, we are having this kind of decline in consumption when it's occurring across the board in every category of income class or consumption class, tells you that there is a really widespread and sweeping problem of effective demand in this country. And therefore, the problem of demand, what he called the death of demand, it's something that is so serious that it has not even been undone by this kind of excess spending by the government. It also turns out that part of that reason is because the nature of that excess spending is completely wrong. A large part of it is because, okay, they did a GST which was as badly conceived, badly implemented, badly everything. I would go further than Arun. Let's not try and reform it, kill it. It's a terrible, terrible tax policy. Malaysia tried it, discovered it didn't work, they have abandoned it. If we've made a mistake, let's admit it and move on. This is not clearly a tax policy that is working. It's delivering less revenues, higher taxes, higher prices for essentials, and much, much worse conditions for most informal enterprises. So GST is one of the issues. But a large part of the other problem is that the money has not been spent where it needs to be spent. When you have a problem of demand, you need to put public spending into areas that have high multiplier effects. The most obvious ones, Arun has already mentioned them: employment, social sector spending, health, education, nutrition. All of these are activities that have high employment and also therefore high multiplier effects. You put spending into areas that are not getting public spending otherwise, in a whole range of backward areas, in infrastructure that is not receiving adequate attention, the last mile connectivity that is important, all of those areas, you put the money in where it will generate the ability for people to spend more through multiplier effects, and it will generate sufficient supply conditions for local level output to meet the rising demand. This is not rocket science. I see several of our students in this room. I'm sure all of them know this in their sleep. They can tell you all of these things. So what's the problem? Why is it not happening? And here I think is the mystery. Again, it's something Dr. Sinha alluded to, that this is a government in denial. But hey, come on, denial for 3 years? Really? Why? What purpose does it serve you to be in denial? What would be wrong with even implementing the things you've promised, like PM Kisan? Why spend only 25% of that money even? What is going on that they are unwilling to do even the most simple things that would revive demand? And I think he outlined one reason, which is that there is, shall we say, this perception that they can trade on the disconnect that seems to have emerged between politics and economics. They can trade on hyper-nationalism and befuddling the people, which seems to have been reasonably successful in certainly the last general elections and some state elections. But this is a policy that can run for only so long. And even though you may find completely new distractions a month from now, maybe a war with Pakistan, maybe something else, God knows. You find some other distraction, it doesn't actually help you to tide over that fundamental issue. I think that's number one. Number two is that, I think this is a government that has just got so used to lying and manipulation that it forgets that you can do that with people, but you can't do that with the economy. The economy kind of runs on other principles, which are not affected by how much you can harangue and or create a miasma of falsehoods that somehow change it. And I think that is something which they haven't understood. They haven't understood that you can't talk the economy out of something. You have to do something about the economy. What would make for a change? Now, here I have to confess I'm in a quandary again, because I think, let me be frank, I think there's a horrible government in every possible respect. However, it's also true that if they do what is reasonable about the economy, that would actually generate a revival and possibly some, positive thinking about them. Nonetheless, as an Indian who is deeply concerned about the future of this country, I think that we cannot allow this terrible state of affairs in the economy to continue, even if it is the ruling party that would benefit from it. In other words, as citizens, we must demand an immediate attention to the revival of demand through employment-intensive activities, and in ways in which the taxation can be raised, as Arun has mentioned, very, very easily. We can talk about the details. I know there is even a session about it later on. But there are many, many ways to raise that money. Anyway, if you're with unutilized capacity and high unemployment, whatever you spend is going to generate multiplier effects that will give you more tax revenues over time. And that, in turn, will mean that your deficit will actually be much less. So I think this is a situation where we have to hope that this government, even though it doesn't have the best interests of the country at heart, and even though its continuation in power is a threat to democracy and everything, nonetheless we must hope that this government actually sees reason with respect to what has to be done on the economy. Thank you.